Imagine being trapped in hell on earth, knowing that tomorrow could be your last day alive. Imagine watching thousands of innocent people walk past you every single day, straight into gas chambers, while you're forced to sort through their belongings, their clothes, their wedding rings. Now imagine planning the impossible, an escape so daring that it would become the largest breakout from any Nazi death camp in history. This is the story of Sobibor, and trust me, you've never heard anything like this before. October 14, 1943. A sunny autumn afternoon in eastern Poland. On this day, around 600 Jewish prisoners in a place called Sobibor did something that shouldn't have been possible. They rose against their Nazi captors, killed nearly a dozen SS guards with axes and knives, and over 300 of them made a desperate run for freedom through minefields and barbed wire, while machine guns tore through the air around them. Only about 50 would survive to see the end of the war, but what they accomplished changed everything. The Nazis were so terrified by what happened that they shut down the entire camp within days and tried to erase it from existence. But why? What made Sobibor different? And how did these prisoners, starving and exhausted, manage to pull off what seems impossible? Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand this story, you need to know what Sobibor really was. In the spring of 1942, deep in the forests of occupied Poland, the Nazis built a death factory. Not a concentration camp where people were worked to death, but something far worse. Sobibor was pure extermination. It had one purpose only: to kill as many Jewish people as possible, as quickly as possible, and then make the bodies disappear. This was part of something called Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to murder every single Jew in occupied Poland. The camp sat next to a small railway station in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick forest. When trains pulled up, prisoners would see what looked almost like a normal village. There were flower beds, neat paths, and even wooden signs with cheerful messages. The Nazis were masters of deception. They wanted people to be calm, compliant, and easier to manage. Some signs pointed to a bathhouse. Others showed cartoon figures of barbers and waiters. Everything was designed to make you think you were going to a work camp, maybe somewhere to take a shower after the long journey. But it was all a lie. Within hours, sometimes within 30 minutes of arrival, almost everyone on those trains would be dead. Here's how it worked. The train would pull up to the platform. SS guards would shout orders. Men, women, and children would be separated. The elderly, the sick, mothers with young children, they'd be told they were going straight to the showers. The able-bodied might be said to work first and shower later. But it didn't matter. Almost all of them were heading to the same place. They'd walk down a path the prisoners called the tube, a narrow fenced corridor lined with tree branches woven through barbed wire so you couldn't see what was ahead. At the end of that path were the gas chambers. The victims would be told to undress, to remember where they left their belongings, and to hurry because others were waiting. Then they'd be pushed into rooms disguised as showers. The doors would slam shut, and instead of water, carbon monoxide from a diesel engine would pump in. Within 15 to 20 minutes, everyone inside was dead. But the horror didn't end there. A small group of Jewish prisoners, about 600 at any given time, were kept alive to operate the camp. These weren't guards or collaborators. They were slaves forced to do the unthinkable. Some had to cut the hair off corpses because the Nazis sold it. Others pulled gold teeth from the dead. Some dragged bodies to massive pits, or later, to outdoor cremation grills made of railway tracks. Still others sorted through the mountains of belongings left behind: clothing, photographs, money, toys, and wedding rings. Can you imagine finding your own family members' possessions in that pile? Because that happened. It happened more than once. The prisoners lived in constant terror. If you got sick, you were shot. If you slowed down, you were shot. If you were caught with an extra piece of bread, you were fired. The SS guards treated them worse than animals. Men like Gustav Wagner, who prisoners called the Beast, would beat people to death for entertainment. The commandant, Franz Reichsleitner, ran the place with cold efficiency. And Deputy Commandant Johann Niemann, who seemed almost friendly sometimes, was just as complicit in the mass murder happening every single day. The prisoners knew they were living on borrowed time. They'd seen what happened at Belzec, another death camp that had shut down. When Belzec closed, they'd sent the last group of prisoners to Sobibor, and those prisoners had sewn desperate messages into their clothes. We worked at Belzec for 1 year and didn't know where we'd be sent. They said Germany. Now we're in Sobibor and we know what awaits us. You'll be killed too. Avenge us. That message was clear. When Sobibor's work was done, everyone still alive would be murdered to eliminate witnesses. By the summer of 1943, the transports were slowing down. The Nazis had already murdered most of the Jews in the surrounding areas. Between 170,000 and 250,000 people had been killed at Sobibor in just over a year. Now rumors began spreading among the prisoners that the camp would soon close. Everyone understood what that meant. Their execution was coming. One man refused to accept that fate. His name was Leon Feldhendler. Leon wasn't what you'd expect when you picture a leader of resistance. He was in his early 30s, from a small Polish town called Zolciuca. His father was a rabbi. Leon had been relatively comfortable before the war, married with children. When the Nazis came, he'd served on the local Judenrat, the Jewish council forced to implement Nazi orders. It was a horrible position, trying to protect your community while following orders from people who wanted you all dead. Eventually, Leon and his family were sent to Sobibor. He watched his parents, his wife, his children, all of them walk into the gas chambers. He survived only because a cousin who was already in the camp pointed him out as a skilled carpenter. Leon worked in the sorting barracks, going through the belongings of the murdered. The job came with a tiny advantage, occasional access to extra food, which meant he could think more clearly than prisoners who were literally starving to death. And Leon used that mental clarity to do something extraordinary. He started organizing. He formed a secret committee, a small group of prisoners who began planning an escape. But here's the thing, they weren't just planning to save themselves. They wanted everyone to escape, every single prisoner in the camp, because they knew if even one person was left behind, or if the Germans realized people were missing before everyone could get out, they'd massacre everyone. It was all or nothing. But they had massive problems. First, none of them had military training. They were tailors, carpenters, bakers, ordinary people. Second, the camp was designed to prevent escape. There were watchtowers with machine guns and barbed wire fences. And worst of all, the entire perimeter was surrounded by minefields. Even if you made it past the wall, one wrong step and you'd be blown apart. Third, the Ukrainian guards who worked for the SS were armed and watching constantly. And finally, the SS men themselves were always alert, always suspicious, always ready to kill at the slightest hint of trouble. Leon and his committee tried several plans. They considered poisoning the guards' food, but the poison was discovered, and 5 prisoners were executed as punishment. They thought about setting fires to create chaos, but the minefields made that suicidal. Every plan seemed impossible. Weeks turned into months. Time was running out. Then, on September 23, 1943, everything changed. A transport arrived from Minsk, carrying about 2,000 Jews from the ghetto there. Most were immediately sent to the gas chambers, but this transport was different. Among the prisoners were Soviet prisoners of war, Jewish soldiers from the Red Army who the Germans had captured. About 80 of these men were selected for work in the camp. And one of them was named Alexander Pechersky. Sasha, as everyone called him, was extraordinary. He was 34 years old, a lieutenant in the Soviet army. Before the war, he'd been a theater director and musician in Rostov-on-Don. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Pechersky had fought on the front lines. He was captured near Vyazma in October of that year. For 2 years, he'd survived the horrific Soviet POW camps where millions of Red Army soldiers died from starvation, disease, and execution. He'd suffered through typhus. He'd attempted escape and been caught. He'd been shuttled from one brutal camp to another, Vyazma, Smolensk, Borisov, Minsk. At one point, the Germans discovered he was Jewish and threw him into an underground cell, basically a death sentence. But somehow, Sasha survived everything. When he arrived at Sobibor and saw the pillar of smoke rising constantly from the camp, he immediately understood what this place was. He later wrote about coming there. How many circles of hell were in Dante's Inferno? 9, I think. How many have I passed through already? However, what made Sasha different was, he was a trained military officer. He was skilled in tactics, organization, and command and control structures. He knew how to think strategically in high-pressure situations, and most importantly, he hadn't been beaten down by months in Sobibor. His spirit wasn't broken yet. The other prisoners noticed him immediately. They'd been trapped in this death camp for months, some for over a year, and suddenly here were these Soviet soldiers who'd actually fought the Germans, who looked them in the eye without fear. It gave people hope. Within days of arrival, Sasha met Leon Feldhendler. That first conversation must have been electric. Leon had the knowledge, the contacts, the commitment. Sasha had the military expertise and the confidence. Leon spoke Yiddish and Polish. Sasha spoke Russian. They needed a translator, and they found one in Shloim Leitman, a Warsaw Jew who became Sasha's closest friend and advisor in the camp. Together, they began planning something that seemed impossible. The plan they developed was audacious. Instead of trying to sneak out or tunnel under the fences, they'd do something the Germans would never expect. They'd kill the SS guards one by one, quietly, methodically, over the course of a single afternoon. They'd take the guards' weapons. Then, at the regular evening roll call, with most of the SS dead and the remaining guards confused, all 600 prisoners would march out the front gate as if they'd been ordered to. In the chaos, they'd overwhelm whatever resistance remained and run for the forest. It was insane, it was brilliant, and it required perfect timing and nerves of steel. Sasha insisted on several things. First, he would personally select who would do the killing. This wasn't going to be about revenge or anger. It needed to be cold, calculated, and done by people who wouldn't hesitate or make mistakes. Second, they'd use the SS guards' own routines against them. The prisoners knew that guards would come to the workshops to have clothes made, boots repaired, and items crafted. Those appointments would become death traps. Third, absolute secrecy. Only the core group could know the full plan until the last possible moment. If word leaked, everyone would die. They chose October 13th for the uprising, which coincidentally fell on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. But at the last moment, a group of SS men unexpectedly showed up at the camp for a visit. They couldn't risk it. The revolt was postponed to October 14th. That turned out to be incredibly lucky. The camp commandant, Reichsleitner, would be away that day, so would some of the worst SS guards. The odds had just improved. On the morning of October 14th, 1943, the sun rose on what seemed like a normal day at Sobibor. Prisoners went to their work assignments. Guards made their rounds. Trains weren't expected. It was quiet, calm. But underneath that calm, hearts were pounding. Axes and knives had been hidden in workshops. The key prisoners involved in the plot had been quietly informed that today was the day. If you weren't part of the plan, you wouldn't know until it was too late. That was essential because anyone could break under pressure, and one word to the wrong person meant death for everyone. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it began. Deputy Commandant Johann Niemann walked into the tailor shop. He'd ordered a new leather coat, and it was ready for fitting. 2 prisoners greeted him warmly. Would he try it on? Of course. As Niemann slipped his arms into the coat, a prisoner named Jacob Biskupich raised an axe and brought it down on his skull. Niemann dropped instantly. They dragged his body to a corner and covered it with rags. They spread sand over the blood. 1 down. Minutes later, SS Sergeant Joseph Wolf entered a storehouse where prisoners sorted the belongings of the murdered. He wanted to inspect a coat. The moment he turned his back, an axe came down. 2 down. In the shoemaker's shop, an SS guard named Siegfried Grieches arrived to pick up boots that had been repaired for him. The prisoners invited him to try them on to ensure they fit properly. As he bent down, they killed him with an axe. 3 down. This pattern repeated across the camp over the next hour. SS guards would arrive for various appointments, routine visits they'd made dozens of times before. They'd be greeted with smiles, with deference, with the same subservient attitude the prisoners always showed. And then, in a split second, axes and knives would come out. These guards, who'd murdered hundreds of thousands of people, who'd tormented and beaten the prisoners daily, never saw it coming. They trusted their own routine. They believed these Jews were too broken, too terrified, too weak to fight back. They were wrong. Within an hour, the prisoners had killed 11 SS men and several Ukrainian guards. They'd stolen weapons from the bodies. They'd cut the telephone and telegraph wires so no one could call for help. But then something went wrong. The plan was to wait until the regular 5 o'clock roll call, when all prisoners would naturally gather in the assembly area. At that point, with most SS dead, they'd march out the gate. But around 4:30, one of the remaining SS guards, Karl Frenzel, discovered a body. He immediately understood what was happening and began shouting for backup. The alarm was raised. Sasha Pechersky made a split-second decision. There was no time for the careful, organized escape they'd planned. It was now or never. He screamed the code words, "Hurrah, the revolt has begun." All hell broke loose. Prisoners started running in every direction. Some had weapons now, rifles and pistols taken from the dead guards. They fired at the watchtowers, trying to suppress the machine guns. Others grabbed whatever they could, tools, pieces of wood, anything. The Ukrainian guards opened fire from the towers. Bullets tore through the air. People fell screaming. The fence was lined with multiple layers of barbed wire. Prisoners threw themselves at it, cutting through with pliers they'd stolen, climbing over, tearing their hands and bodies on the sharp wire. Behind the fence was the minefield. People ran forward anyway, knowing some would die but hoping most would make it through. Explosions ripped through the ground. Bodies flew into the air. The smell of blood and smoke filled everything. Out of the chaos, a stream of prisoners broke through. 50 people, 100, 200. They ran toward the forest, bullets chasing them, mines exploding around them. Some prisoners stayed behind, too afraid to run or believing they'd never make it. Others were cut down in the first seconds of the breakout, but over 300 managed to get past the fences, past the mines, into the trees. Behind them, Sobibor was in chaos. The surviving SS guards were panicking. They'd lost control completely. Prisoners, the people they'd treated as less than human, had killed their comrades and escaped. It was their worst nightmare. But making it out of the camp was only the beginning. The forest offered cover, but it was also full of dangers. German army units, police, and SS were immediately mobilized to hunt down the escapees. The local Polish population was a mixed blessing. Some people helped, hiding Jews at great risk to themselves. Others turned them in to the Germans for rewards, or simply killed them out of antisemitism. Of the 300 or so who escaped the camp, many were recaptured in the first few days. The Germans offered rewards for information. They sent patrols through the forests. Local collaborators betrayed hiding places. Some escapees were blown up by mines after they thought they were safe. Others died of wounds or exposure. It was a nightmare. Sasha Pechersky led a group of about 50 prisoners into the forest. For a few days, he stayed with them, helping organize their movement, trying to keep them alive. However, he then made a controversial decision. He told the Polish Jews in the group that he and the other Soviet soldiers were leaving. They were going to try to cross back into Soviet-controlled territory and rejoin the Red Army. He took most of the weapons and money with him. To the Polish Jews left behind, it felt like abandonment. Many years later, survivor Thomas Blatt would ask Sasha why he left them. Sasha's answer was blunt. "My job was done. You were Polish Jews in your own terrain. I belonged in the Soviet Union and was still a soldier." It's one of the more complicated aspects of the story. Sasha had led the uprising brilliantly, but when it came to the aftermath, he prioritized his own people and his duty as a Soviet officer. Some survivors understood it. Others never forgave him. Sasha and his men managed to cross the Bug River into Soviet-controlled territory. He joined a partisan unit and later rejoined the Red Army. Because he'd been a prisoner of war, Stalin's brutal order meant he was considered a suspect. Instead of being welcomed as a hero, he was sent to a penal battalion, the units given the most dangerous missions as punishment. He fought in some of the war's toughest battles. He was seriously wounded in the leg, but he survived. By the end of the war, he'd been promoted to captain and received medals for bravery. Meanwhile, the other escapees scattered across occupied Poland. Some joined partisan groups, fighting the Germans from the forests. Some were hidden by brave Polish families who risked their lives to protect them. Some spent years moving from hideout to hideout, always one step ahead of capture. Out of the 300 who escaped, Only about 50 to 60 survived until the end of the war in 1945. But what they'd accomplished was enormous. 3 days after the uprising, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, personally ordered Sobibor to be shut down immediately. The Nazis were terrified that word of the successful escape would inspire uprisings in other camps. They couldn't allow that, so they dismantled everything. They brought in prisoners from Treblinka, another death camp, to tear down the buildings, dig up the mass grave, and burn the remaining bodies. Then they murdered those prisoners too. They bulldozed the entire site flat and planted trees over it. They tried to make Sobibor disappear from history as if it had never existed. But they failed because the survivors made sure the world knew. Thomas Blatt, who was only 15 when he escaped, spent decades telling the story. He wrote books, gave testimony at trials, and spoke at schools. He wanted people to know what happened, to remember the victims, to understand what the Nazis tried to hide. Sasha Pechersky also spent his life trying to make people remember. Right after the war, he gave testimony to Soviet authorities about what he'd witnessed at Sobibor. His account was published in a book in 1945, but the Soviet government didn't want to emphasize Jewish suffering specifically. They preferred to talk about general Soviet losses. They wouldn't let Sasha travel abroad to testify at trials. When the movie Escape from Sobibor was made in 1987, the Soviets refused to let him attend the premiere in the United States. He died in 1990 in Rostov-on-Don, his hometown, still fighting to make sure Sobibor wasn't forgotten. Leon Feldhendler, the other leader of the uprising, had a tragic end. He survived the escape and hid in the Lublin area until Soviet forces liberated it in July 1944. But in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended in Europe, he was shot and killed. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some sources say it was an armed robbery. Others suggest he was targeted by anti-Semitic Polish nationalists who resented Jewish survivors returning to reclaim their property. Either way, this man who'd risked everything to save his fellow prisoners, who'd helped organize the most successful camp uprising in history, never got to see the end of the war. What happened at Sobibor matters for several reasons. First, it destroys the myth that Jews went passively to their deaths during the Holocaust. That lie needs to die. The truth is that Jewish people resisted in countless ways, from armed uprisings to smuggling food to simply refusing to let the Nazis destroy their humanity. Sobibor is proof of that. These prisoners were starving, exhausted, traumatized, surrounded by guards with machine guns, and they still fought back. They killed their captors. They freed themselves. That takes unbelievable courage. Second, the uprising directly led to Sobibor being shut down. Now, it's important to be clear, by October 1943, the Nazis had already murdered most of the Jews they'd targeted in that region. The camp might have closed soon anyway, but the revolt accelerated it. It made the Nazis panic, and it's very possible that some transports scheduled for Sobibor were diverted or cancelled because of the uprising. Every single life saved matters. Third, Sobibor proved that even in the most impossible circumstances, organized resistance could succeed. Yes, most of the escapees were eventually killed. Yes, the odds were overwhelming, but over 50 people survived who would have otherwise been murdered. 50 people who went on to have families, to bear witness, to make sure the world remembered. That's nothing, that's everything. The survivors carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with guilt, survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others died. They had nightmares. They bore physical and emotional scars that never fully healed, but they also had children and grandchildren who exist because of the impossible thing that happened on October 14, 1943. Today, there's a memorial at the site of Sobibor. Archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of the gas chambers, the railway platform, and personal items that belonged to the victims. The forest has grown over most of it, just as the Nazis intended. But it's no longer hidden. People know what happened there. There are also memorials to Sasha Pechersky in Russia and Israel. Streets are named after him, a foundation dedicated to preserving his story. In 2013, decades after his death, the Russian government finally awarded him the Order of Courage, recognition for what he'd accomplished. But perhaps the best memorial is the story itself, still being told, still being passed down, because the Nazis wanted to kill everyone and erase all evidence. They wanted those 250,000 victims at Sobibor to be forgotten, to disappear without a trace. The uprising made sure that didn't happen. Every time someone learns about Sobibor, the Nazis fail again. Think about what Leon Feldhendler and Sasha Pechersky accomplished. They were just two men, one a rabbi's son from a small Polish town, the other a musician and theater director from Russia. They had no resources, no weapons, no hope of outside help. They were trapped in a death factory specifically designed to kill them. And yet they organized, they planned, they inspired hundreds of people to risk everything in one desperate moment, and they succeeded. Yes, most died anyway. Yes, the cost was enormous, but they proved something essential. They proved that human dignity and the will to resist can survive even in hell. They proved that evil, no matter how powerful, can be fought. They proved that giving up is not inevitable. That's the real story of Sobibor, not just an escape, but a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a refusal to go quietly, a determination to fight back, even when fighting back seems impossible. The prisoners who died in the escape died free. They died fighting. They died as human beings reclaiming their dignity, not as victims led to slaughter. That matters. And the ones who survived carried forward the memory of everyone who didn't make it. They ensured the world knew what happened. They made sure the dead weren't forgotten. So when you hear about the Holocaust, remember Sobibor. Remember that resistance happened. Remember that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were people who refused to accept their fate. Remember Leon Feldhendler spending his last hours in the camp, sorting through the belongings of murdered families, planning an escape he might not survive. Remember, Sasha Pechersky arrives at hell and immediately organizes a rebellion. Remember the prisoners who grabbed axes and knives and attacked guards who'd tormented them for months. Remember the ones who ran through minefields while machine guns fired, choosing a death on their own terms over passive execution. Remember them all, because remembering is how we honor them. Remembering is how we ensure that the Nazis' attempt to erase them fails. Remembering is how we pass on the lesson they taught, that resistance is possible, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that human dignity can never be fully destroyed. The Sobibor uprising happened 81 years ago, but the courage it represents, the refusal to submit, the determination to fight for life and freedom, that's timeless. That's the inheritance left to us by Leon Feldhendler, Sasha Pechersky, Thomas Blatt, Chaim Engel, Selma Weinberg, and all the others who survived. It's also the inheritance of the hundreds who died in the attempt, who ran toward freedom knowing they probably wouldn't make it, but ran anyway. That's the true story of the prisoners who escaped a death camp. It's a story of horror, yes, but it's also a story of incredible bravery, of human beings at their best in the face of absolute evil. And it's a story that deserves to be told again and again, for as long as people need reminding that resistance is possible, that hope can survive anywhere, and that sometimes, even in the darkest places imaginable, the impossible can happen. October 14th, 1943, a sunny autumn afternoon, and the day that hell burned down around the demons who created it, set ablaze by the very people they'd condemned to die. That's not just history, that's inspiration, that's proof. That's why we remember Sobibor.